mockery echoed through the auction house when she gambled her last dime on a condemned, toxic ruin. Nobody else wanted the crumbling Oak Haven warehouse. Yet the secret locked behind a hidden steel vault would soon expose a century-old scandal, rewrite a city's history, and put a lethal target squarely on her back. The municipal building in downtown Scranton was suffocatingly warm for a bleak Tuesday in November. Jordan Jenkins sat in the third row of folding chairs, her fingers nervously twisting the worn leather strap of her purse. She was 28, drowning in the medical debt her late father had left behind, and desperate for a miracle to save her failing architectural salvage business, Jenkins Reclamation. At the front of the room, David Halloway, a county auctioneer with a monotone voice and a cheap suit, was rattling off foreclosed commercial properties. Most of the men in the room were seasoned real estate developers. They were sharks, waiting for prime lots to be liquidated for pennies. Among them sat Richard Sterling. Richard was the heir to Sterling Enterprises, a local real estate monopoly that had practically bought up half the county over the last 3 generations. He was 35, dressed in a tailored cashmere coat that mocked the working-class grit of the room, and he had made a sport out of driving Jordan's family business into the ground. Whenever Jordan tried to bid on a historic property to salvage its copper-stained glass or antique timber, Richard would outbid her, only to bulldoze the lots to build strip malls. Next item, David droned, tapping his pen on the podium. Lot 44. The property located at 809 Oak Haven Street, formerly the Cobb Manufacturing Depot. Structure is condemned, roof is partially collapsed. Environmental hazards highly likely. Opening bid is $10,000. A collective groan rippled through the room. Everyone knew 809 Oak Haven. It was an eyesore, a massive, decaying brick warehouse sitting on the edge of the industrial district. It had been abandoned since the late 1980s when the last of the Cobb family, an eccentric recluse named Jeremiah Cobb, passed away without an heir. Since then, it had become a haven for raccoons and rot. Rumors circulated that the soil was poisoned with lead and that the city would eventually force whoever bought it to pay hundreds of thousands in environmental cleanup fees. 10,000, David asked, looking around the silent room. Do I have 10? Richard Sterling leaned back in his chair, catching Jordan's eye. He offered a condescending smirk, silently mocking her empty pockets. Jordan's heart hammered against her ribs. She had exactly $12,000 in her business account. It was her safety net, her payroll, her rent. But she also knew something about 809 Oak Haven that the developers didn't. Her father, before he got sick, used to tell her stories about the old Cobb warehouse. He claimed it was built with old-growth hard pine timbers and imported Belgian brick. If she could carefully deconstruct the interior, the salvaged materials alone could fetch $50,000 from boutique builders in New York. It was a massive gamble. If the wood was too rotted from the collapsed roof, she would be completely bankrupt. 10,000. David sighed, preparing to slam his gavel. Going once, going 10,000, Jordan blurted out, her voice trembling slightly. The room went dead silent. Heads snapped to look at her. Richard Sterling let out a sharp, audible laugh. Is that a joke, Jordan? Richard called out, not bothering to lower his voice. You're buying the Oak Haven dump. You'd be better off setting your money on fire. At least it would keep you warm. Punani. Jordan ignored him, keeping her eyes locked on the auctioneer. I have 10,000 from Miss Jenkins, David said, raising an eyebrow. Any advances? 11? No, sold to Jordan Jenkins for $10,000. The gavel cracked like a gunshot. Jordan felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had just bought a condemned ruin. By the time she drove her beat-up pickup truck to Oak Haven Street that afternoon, the reality of her purchase was sinking in. The warehouse was surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence intertwined with dead ivy. The brick facade was heavily water-stained and half of the frosted glass windows were shattered. She unlocked the heavy padlock on the front gate with the key the county had given her, the hinges shrieking in protest as she pushed it open. Stepping inside the main floor was like stepping into a tomb. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, wet paper, and decades of undisturbed dust. Pigeons fluttered in the steel rafters high above. To her dismay, the center of the roof had indeed caved in, allowing years of rain and snow to rot the wooden floorboards in the middle of the room. Jordan spent the next 3 hours carefully navigating the perimeter with a flashlight and a tape measure, documenting what could be saved. The structural timbers near the walls were surprisingly intact, thick and dense. There were vintage industrial light fixtures she could clean up and sell. It wasn't the gold mine she had prayed for, but it was enough to keep her business afloat for another few months as the sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the debris. Jordan started mapping the floor plan on a piece of graph paper. She measured the interior south wall, 85 feet. She frowned. Earlier, when she was outside checking the foundation, she had paced the exterior of that same south wall. It had been roughly 100 feet long. Jordan walked outside into the biting November wind and paced it again. 100 feet. She went back inside and ran her tape measure along the interior wall. 85 feet. There was a 15-foot discrepancy. Her pulse quickened. She grabbed a heavy crowbar from her truck and walked to the back corner of the interior south wall. It was covered in cheap, water-damaged drywall that looked distinctly newer than the 1920s brick of the rest of the building. She tapped the drywall with the metal tip of the crowbar. It sounded hollow. Taking a deep breath, Jordan swung the crowbar. The heavy iron head easily punctured the rotting drywall, sending a cloud of white gypsum dust into the air. She swung again and again, ripping away large chunks of the cheap partition. Behind the drywall wasn't brick. It was a massive industrial steel door. It was deeply rusted, bolted directly into a reinforced concrete frame. In the center of the door was a heavy brass combination dial, oxidized completely green with age. Jordan stood there in the dimming light, her breathing shallow. The county records had said nothing about a vault, and a vault of this size 15 feet deep, spanning the entire width of the building, was practically a bank bunker. She pressed her hand against the cold steel. No one wanted this warehouse, but whoever built this room clearly wanted to ensure that whatever was inside was never ever found. Jordan couldn't sleep that night. Her mind raced with visions of what could possibly be locked inside a 15-foot deep vault, hidden in a bankrupt manufacturer's condemned warehouse. By 6 a.m. the next morning, she was sitting in the diner across from Artie Brennan's locksmith shop, waiting for the neon open sign to flicker on. Artie was a 60-year-old former Navy machinist who smelled permanently of cheap cigars and WD-40. He was the best metal worker in the county, and more importantly, he owed Jordan's late father a few favors. "You bought the Cobb property." Artie grunted an hour later, stepping out of his service van and eyeing the crumbling warehouse with deep suspicion. "Your dad was a smart man, Jordan, but the apple must have rolled a few miles from the tree. This place is a death trap. Just look at the door, Artie," Jordan said, leading him through the debris to the back of the building. When Artie saw the steel wall, his cynical demeanor vanished. He approached the door slowly, running a calloused, grease-stained thumb over the green brass dial. "This isn't a standard safe door," Artie muttered, pulling a magnifying glass from his overalls. "This is a Mosler bank vault door. Class 3, Cladivelas, built sometime in the late 20s. We're talking solid manganese steel, drill-proof, torch-resistant. You could drive a bulldozer into this thing and it wouldn't dent. Can you open it?" Jordan asked, holding her breath. Artie let out a low whistle. "Not by picking the lock. The internal tumblers are probably rusted into a solid block of iron by now. Only way through is to cut the hinges and use hydraulic rams to force the locking bolts out of the frame. It's going to take hours, and it's going to ruin a lot of my cutting blades. I'll pay you whatever you want, Artie. I'll give you a cut of whatever is inside." Artie looked at her, his eyes softening slightly. "Your old man bailed me out of a bad spot 10 years ago. I'll open the door, but you keep whatever is in there. Honestly, it's probably just a century's worth of black mold and rat skeletons. For the next 6 hours, the warehouse echoed with the deafening scream of an angle grinder and the blinding blue-white sparks of an oxyacetylene torch. Jordan nervously paced the floor, occasionally bringing RT thermoses of black coffee. By early afternoon, the air was thick with the acrid smell of burning metal. "All right, back up," Artie yelled over his shoulder, pulling his welding mask up. He grabbed a heavy hydraulic wedge, jammed it into the searing hot gap he had carved near the locking mechanism, and began pumping the handle. With a terrifying groaning crack that reverberated in Jordan's chest, the massive locking bolts gave way. The heavy steel door sagged an inch on its ruined hinges. Artie wedged a 5-foot pry bar into the seam. "Give me a hand, kid." Jordan threw her weight against the bar alongside him. With a screech of tortured metal, the heavy vault door slowly swung outward. A rush of cold, dead air poured out of the darkness. It didn't smell like mold or rot. It smelled sharply of cedar, mothballs, and machine oil. The environment inside the vault had been completely hermetically sealed. Jordan clicked on her heavy-duty flashlight and shined the beam into the pitch-black room. It was an enormous space, completely pristine and untouched by the water damage that had ruined the rest of the warehouse. Lined against the walls were heavy metal shelving units holding dozens of wooden crates, all stamped with a logo, Cobb Manufacturing, 1931. In the center of the room sat 4 large, bulky shapes covered in heavy canvas tops. Artie stood in the doorway, entirely speechless. Jordan walked in, her footsteps echoing softly on the dry concrete floor. She approached the closest top in the center of the room and gripped the edge of the canvas. She gave it a hard pull, sending a localized cloud of dust into the air. Underneath was a pristine, gleaming antique automobile. But it wasn't just any car. It was a 1928 Duesenberg Model J, completely flawless, its chrome details shining brilliantly under the beam of her flashlight. Beside it, she yanked off the other tops. A 1930 Cadillac V16, a 1929 Packard Speedster, and a custom-built Indian motorcycle. "Good Lord," Artie whispered behind her, finally finding his voice. Jordan, those cars, in this condition. You're looking at millions of dollars. Multiples. This is a museum." Jordan felt dizzy, but her eyes were drawn away from the gleaming vehicles to a heavy, ornate iron lockbox sitting alone on a desk at the far end of the vault. While Artie was busy hovering around the Duesenberg, mesmerized by the engine block, Jordan walked over to the desk. The knockbox wasn't secured. The latch was merely clicked shut. She opened it. Inside were no jewels or cash. Instead, there were stacks of perfectly preserved leather-bound ledgers, a thick bundle of property deeds, and several manila envelopes sealed with dark red wax. Jordan opened the top ledger. The handwriting inside was elegant and sharp, dated April 14, 1932. It was a meticulous accounting book detailing massive undocumented loans, property seizures, and payoffs to local judges. She scanned the names. Her blood ran cold. The ledger wasn't just a record of Jeremiah Cobb's business. It was a blackmail file. Cobb had been the banker for the city's criminal underworld during Prohibition, and the name written next to the largest, most damning transactions were involving extortion, bribery, and hostile land takeovers that forced dozens of local families into poverty was William Sterling, Richard Sterling's great-grandfather. Jordan flipped through the pages frantically. The deeds in the box, they weren't just random papers. They were the original undoctored deeds to half of downtown Scranton. The documents proved that the foundation of a Sterling real estate empire had been built on massive fraud and theft. If these documents saw the light of day, the Sterling family would face historic, devastating lawsuits from the descendants of the families they had ruined. Their empire would instantly crumble. Jeremiah Cobb hadn't just hidden his prized cars in this vault. He had hidden his insurance policy. Jordan's hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the ledger. She had suddenly gone from a bankrupt scavenger to a millionaire. But she was also holding a financial nuclear bomb that could destroy the most powerful family in the state. Jordan. Audrey's voice snapped her out of her shock. His tone had changed. It was tight, anxious. Jordan looked up. Artie was standing near the vault door, looking out in the main warehouse. "We got company," he said softly. Jordan shoved the ledger back into the iron box, closed it, and walked quickly to the vault entrance. Through the ruined interior of the warehouse, she saw the silhouette of a man walking purposefully through the debris, flanked by two larger men in dark coats. The mud man stopped about 20 feet away from the vault. He pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his coat pocket, dusted off a relatively clean wooden crate, and sat down on it, crossing his legs. It was Richard Sterling. "Well, well, well, Jordan." Richard's voice echoed through the cold, hollow space, his eyes locking onto the massive, opened steel door behind her. He offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It looks like my grandfather was right about the old Cobb place after all. You see, I've had a change of heart. I realized it was terribly unfair of me to let you shoulder the burden of this toxic dump." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a sleek, leather checkbook. "I'm prepared to offer you $500,000 for the property, right now as is," Richard said, his voice smooth and lethally calm. "But you and the locksmith have to leave. Immediately. And whatever you saw in that room, you never saw it at all." Jordan stood frozen in the doorway, the cold air of the vault pressing against her back. The game had just changed, and the stakes were suddenly life and death. Jordan's knuckles turned white as she gripped the handle of the heavy iron lockbox. The sudden appearance of Richard Sterling in the freezing, ruined warehouse wasn't a coincidence. He hadn't just been trying to buy the property at auction to build a strip mall. He had been trying to secure the Cobb vault before anyone else found it. $500,000, Jordan repeated, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. "For a condemned warehouse you said was a toxic dump. You're overpaying, Richard." Richard chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He gestured to the two massive men flanking him. One of them, a thick-necked enforcer with a scarred jaw, subtly cracked his knuckles. "Let's not play games, Jordan. You're a smart girl, but you're out of your depth," Richard said, standing up from the crate. He took a slow step toward the vault. "My family has known about Jeremiah Cobb's little hideaway for decades. We just didn't know exactly where he built it. When the county finally seized the property, I thought it would be a simple acquisition. I didn't count on your desperate, sentimental bid." Jordan glanced over her shoulder at the multi-million-dollar antique cars gleaming in the flashlight beams. "You want the Duesenberg?" "I don't care about the cars," Richard snapped, his sophisticated veneer cracking for a fraction of a second. His eyes darted to the iron box in Jordan's hands. "I want the paper, the Cobb ledgers. Hand over the box, Jordan, and walk away with $500,000. If you don't, my associates here, Mr. Briggs and Mr. Lawson, will simply take it from you. And then I'll see to it that Jenkins' reclamation is buried under so many lawsuits and zoning violations that you'll be paying legal fees until the day you die." Artie Brennan stepped forward, placing his bulk between Jordan and the vault entrance. He still held the heavy 5-foot steel pry bar he had used to force the door open. "You boys take one more step, and I'll scramble your brains like Sunday eggs," Artie growled, hefting the solid steel bar. Briggs, the scarred enforcer, reached inside his dark coat. "No weapons," Richard hissed sharply. "Do you want to bring the federal authorities down on us over a property dispute?" "Just grab the box." Jordan's mind raced. They were trapped in a 15-foot steel box with only one exit. If Briggs and Lawson rushed them, Artie might take one down, but he was 60 years old. They would overpower him, take the ledger, and the truth about the Sterling family's stolen empire would be burned in an incinerator by midnight. She needed a distraction. Jordan looked at Artie, then looked pointedly at the oxyacetylene torch rig sitting just outside the vault door. its tank still hissing slightly. Artie, a veteran mechanic who had survived worse odds in the Navy, followed her gaze. He gave a microscopic nod. "All right, Richard," Jordan said loudly, taking a step forward and holding the iron box out with both hands. "You win. I can't fight you. Take it." Richard smiled triumphantly. "A very pragmatic choice, Jordan. Bring it here." Jordan took another step out of the vault. As she did, Artie suddenly swung the heavy steel pry bar not at the men, but directly at the pressure valve of the acetylene tank resting near the drywall. The heavy bar sheared the brass valve clean off. A deafening high-pressure roar echoed through the warehouse as highly flammable gas violently vented into the confined space. In the exact same fluid motion, Artie grabbed his striker, sparked it, and threw it at a pile of oily, dry-rotted canvas tarps near the men's feet. Douche, cost. A massive wall of thick, blinding yellow fire erupted between them and Richard's men. The sudden heat and smoke forced Richard and his enforcers to stumble backward, coughing and shielding their faces. "Run, kid!" Artie bellowed over the roar of the flames. Jordan didn't hesitate. Touching the heavy iron box to her chest, she sprinted in the opposite direction, sprinting toward the rear loading dock of the warehouse. Artie was right on her heels, his heavy work boots thudding against the rotting floorboards. "Get them!" Richard screamed from behind the wall of fire, his voice breaking with panic. "Don't let her leave with that box." Jordan hit the rusted emergency exit door with her shoulder. It burst open, spilling them out into the freezing November night. They scrambled over the overgrown weeds and broken glass of the alleyway, making a frantic dash for Jordan's beat-up pickup truck parked near the side fence. She threw the iron box onto the passenger seat, jammed the key into the ignition, and pumped the gas pedal. The old engine sputtered, choked, and then roared to life. Artie threw himself into the passenger side just as Briggs burst through the emergency exit, a heavy flashlight in his hand. Jordan slammed the truck into gear and stomped on the accelerator. The tires spun on the wet pavement before catching traction, throwing a shower of gravel backward. They tore out of the alley and onto Oakhaven Street, leaving the crumbling warehouse and Richard Sterling in the rearview mirror. For 10 minutes, Jordan drove erratically, taking sharp turns down residential side streets and weaving through the industrial park to make sure they weren't being followed. Her heart was beating so hard she felt it in her teeth. "You okay, Artie?" she gasped, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. Artie let out a long, ragged breath and wiped a smear of soot from his forehead. "I'm getting too old for this, kid. Next time you hire me, warn me there's going to be an arson and a high-speed chase." He looked down at the iron box sitting between them. "So, what exactly is in the box that made the Prince of Scranton want to play gangster?" Jordan pulled the truck into the empty parking lot of an all-night diner on the edge of the county line, shutting off the headlights. "Proof," Jordan whispered, staring at the dark metal box. "Proof that the Sterling family built their entire fortune by extorting and robbing the people of this city. At 8 a.m., Jordan and Artie stepped into the sleek lobby of Gable Wright & Associates, far from Scranton and Richard Sterling's reach. Exhausted but focused, Jordan placed Jeremiah Cobb's 1932 ledger and a stack of wax-sealed deeds before attorney Harrison Gable, a man known for tearing down powerful institutions. The room fell silent as he examined the documents with gloved hands. Minutes stretched. Then he removed his glasses, his expression shifting from disbelief to sharp, calculated interest. "Miss Jenkins," he said slowly, "this isn't just corruption. It's a blueprint for an empire built on fraud." He explained how William Sterling had used illicit prohibition money to fund predatory loans during the Great Depression, then seized properties through forged documents and bribery when victims defaulted. The deeds Jordan carried were the originals, proof that much of Sterling Enterprises' holdings stood on stolen ground. Artie exhaled. "You're talking about taking down everything." "I am," Gable replied. Then he slid forward a single yellowed deed. "But this part is yours, Jordan read the name Thomas Jenkins. Her great-grandfather. Gable revealed the rest: sabotage, arson, forced debt. Her family hadn't failed, they had been destroyed. Grief tightened in her chest, but it quickly hardened into resolve. "What do we do?" she asked. Gable smiled thinly. "We go federal, and we make it impossible to ignore." Within 48 hours, the story detonated nationwide. With evidence in the hands of a top investigative journalist, the headlines spread like wildfire, exposing a century-old empire built on theft, and a legacy finally ready to be reclaimed. By Monday morning, the fallout was catastrophic for Richard Sterling. News bands surrounded the Sterling Tower in downtown Scranton. The FBI raided the corporate offices, seizing servers and file cabinets. The state attorney general announced an immediate investigation into the legitimacy of the Sterling family's land holdings. Richard Sterling, arrogant to the bitter end, attempted to host a press conference claiming the documents were elaborate forgeries planted by Jordan Jenkins to extort him. But his lies collapsed instantly when the FBI forensic team, alongside federal historians, verified the age of the ink, the paper, and the chemical composition of the wax seals. Furthermore, they raided the Oak Haven warehouse, securing the 4 pristine antique vehicles in the physical vault. The sheer scale of the historical find made international news. Within a week, the board of directors at Sterling Enterprises forced Richard to step down as CEO to mitigate the PR disaster. But it wasn't enough. The stock plummeted by 80%. Class action lawsuits from the descendants of the families William Sterling had ruined began pouring in, spearheaded by Harrison Gable's firm. As the criminal investigations mounted, Richard's legal team tried to offer Jordan a massive, quiet settlement. $10 million to drop her specific claim on the downtown property. Jordan refused. She didn't want a settlement. She wanted her family's land back. It took nearly a year of brutal litigation in federal court, but the judge's ruling was unprecedented. Due to the undeniable proof of criminal fraud that transferred the title in 1931, the court voided the Sterling claim to the downtown sector. The land and the massive commercial value tied to it was legally restored to the sole living heir of Thomas Jenkins, Jordan. On a bright, crisp morning the following spring, Jordan stood outside the old Oak Haven warehouse. The rusted chain-link fence was gone. Ruined brick was being carefully stabilized by a team of structural engineers. She wasn't tearing it down. Jordan had used her newly acquired immense wealth to transform Jenkins' reclamation from a struggling salvage yard into a massive state-of-the-art historical preservation and architecture firm. Her first project was the complete restoration of the Cobb warehouse. The massive vault was being converted into a public high-security museum to display the Duesenberg, the Cadillac, and the Packard, which the courts had awarded to her as the legal owner of the property. Artie Brennan walked up beside her, holding 2 cups of coffee. He was officially on her payroll now, acting as the chief restoration mechanic for the antique vehicles. He handed her a cup and looked up at the new, gleaming brass sign being installed above the warehouse doors. It read, "The Jenkins Foundation." "You know," Artie said, taking a sip of his coffee, "your dad would be real proud of you, kid. You didn't just save his business. You took back the whole damn city." Jordan smiled, taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air. She looked at the heavy steel vault door, visible through the cleared-out center of the building. She had risked her last dime on a broken-down ruin that everyone else had laughed at. But behind the rot, the rust, and the lies, she had found the truth. And it had changed everything. "Come on, Artie," Jordan said, turning toward the entrance. "We've got work to do." If Jordan's journey from bankruptcy to reclaiming her family's stolen empire kept you on the edge of your seat, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, real-life mysteries and hidden history uncovered. Drop a comment below. What would you do if you found a secret vault? See you in the next video. Now,